Wait, Microsoft has a game engine? Well, apparently yes. Microsoft has a game making tool that, to summarize it quickly, is a Scratch type game engine. If you've seen some of my other videos, you may know that I make my games with Unity, and Unity uses C# as its programming language. But Microsoft's Make Code Arcade uses a block-based language, making it easier for people to get into coding and making games. But is it any good? Well, let's find out. My plan is to make 2 games from the tutorial section, Chase the Pizza and Collect the Clovers. Then after following those tutorials, I'll make my own side-scroller shooter as the final test. The Chase the Pizza tutorial, and the goal of the game is to eat as much pizza as you can before the timer runs out. Time the player catches the pizza, you get a point and the countdown is restarted. The first thing in the tutorial is making the game background. To do that, I clicked on the scene toolbox and put the set background color to block into the on start block. Then I changed the background color from the default gray to green. Next, I went into the sprites toolbox and made a new player sprite. After making the player sprite, I changed its color to purple. Then I went into the controller toolbox and added a move my sprite block. Next, I went into the sprites toolbox and added a new sprite, and I renamed it to pizza. After that, I changed the pizza's kind to food. Then I changed the pizza sprite to, well, pizza. Next, I went into the sprite toolbox and added an on overlap block, and edited it to check if the player overlaps with the pizza. After, I went into the info toolbox and put a change score by 1 block into the overlap block. Then I added a set my position 2 block and changed my sprite to pizza. After that, I went into the math toolbox and added 2 pick random blocks into the set position X and Y position. Next, I set the pick random on the X position to 10 and 160, and on the Y position, I set it to 10 and 120. Then I went into the info toolbox and added a start countdown block into the overlap block. And that was the last step. Here's a clip of me playing the final game. Now I have to make the Collect the Clovers game. The Collect the Clovers game is a garden game where the player has to collect 4-leaf clovers while avoiding bees. The first thing I did was go into the scene toolbox and add a set background color to block into the on start block. Then I changed the background from gray to a field with mountains and a city in the background. After I changed the background, I went into the sprites and added a set hero to sprite block under the set background block. Next, I changed the hero sprite from gray to a rabbit. After that, I went into the controller toolbox and added a move hero with buttons block into the on start block. Then I went into the sprites toolbox and added a set hero stay on screen block. Next, I tested out the game so far and it seemed to be working. After, I went into the game toolbox and added an on game update every millisecond block. Then I changed the amount of time from 200 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds. After, I went into the sprites toolbox and added a set clover 2 block into the on game update every millisecond. Next, I changed the sprite from a gray square to a 4-leaf clover. Then I went into the math toolbox and added a pick random number block and put it into the set clover block X and Y position. After, I went into the sprites toolbox and added a set B2 block under the set clover 2 block. Next, I changed the sprite from a gray square to a B, and I added a pick random number block to the X and Y positions. And I went into the sprites toolbox and added the set B2 kind of block into the game update. Next, I went into the sprites toolbox and added an on-screen overlap block. After, I went into the sprites toolbox and added a destroy other sprite block into the on sprite overlap block. Then I tried out the game, and now when the player collides with the clover gets destroyed. Next, I clicked plus on the destroy block and changed the effect to play from spray to fire. After, I went into the music toolbox and added a play sound block into the sprite overlap block. Then I went into the info toolbox and added a change score by 1 block into the on sprite overlap block. Next, I duplicated the on sprite overlap code and changed it to detect the overlap from the player and the enemy. After, I went into the destroy sprite in the enemy overlap and changed its effect to ashes. Then I changed the sound it plays when you overlap with the enemy to a zapped sound. Next, I got rid of the change score by 1 block and went into the info toolbox and replaced it with a change life by -1 block. And that was the last step. Here's a clip of the final game. Now that I have followed the 2 tutorials, I have to make the final game a side-scroller shooter game. The last game I'm making with Microsoft to make Code Arcade is a side-scroller shooter game. My idea for the game is pretty simple. The player has 3 lives and can move up or down. They also have to shoot incoming enemies to get points. So I made the project and named it Side-Scroller Shooter and started coding the game. First, I made a new sprite, and I changed the sprite from gray to a dinosaur I found in the gallery. After making and finding the sprite, I renamed it to Dino. Next, I went into the controller toolbox and gave it a move with buttons block. Then I went into the sprite toolbox and added a stay on screen block. After, I went into the scene toolbox and added a set background block and got a background from the gallery. And I tested the game out so far and everything seemed to be working well. Next, I clicked the plus button on the move with buttons block and made it so the player could only move on the y-axis. Then I went into the sprites toolbox and added a set position block and set the player's position to be on the right side of the screen. And tested the game out so far. Now the player can only move up or down from the left side of the screen. With the player done, I went into the controller toolbox and added an on a button pressed block. Inside the block, I got a set projectile glide from the sprites toolbox and made it only glide on the x-axis from the left side of the screen. After, I set the projectile sprite to a meteor that I found in the gallery. Then I went into the sprites toolbox and got a set position 2 block and set the position to the dino's x and y position. After, I tried out the game and the shooting was working well, but the meteor sprite was too big. So I went back into the gallery and got a smaller sprite and tried it out and it felt a lot better. Next, I went into the game toolbox and added an on game update block. In the on game update, I made a new projectile for the enemy and made it always go to the right side of the screen. Then I went into the gallery and changed its sprite to a cool bat I saw. After getting the sprite, I changed its name to Bat. Next, I went into the sprites toolbox and added a set sprite to kind of block and set the bat to a kind of enemy. And then I duplicated the meteor set position block and added it into the on game update. After I reset the values to make the enemy spawn from the right side of the screen and tried out the game. Now we have the player movement and also meteor shooting and the enemy movement. But when we shoot the enemy, nothing happens, and when the enemy hits us, nothing happens. So I went back into the editor to fix that. But first, I made the enemy spawn less frequently and set its spawn rate to 700 milliseconds. After that, I went into the sprites toolbox and added an on sprite overlap block. Then I changed it to get overlaps from the player and the enemy. Next, I went into the info toolbox and added a change life by -1 block. Then I went into the sprites and added a destroy block and made it destroy the enemy. After, I clicked the plus button on the destroy block to add an effect when the enemy gets destroyed. I chose the fire effect and made it play for 100 milliseconds. Then I tested out the game. Now, if the enemy overlaps with the player loses a life and it destroys the enemy and plays a fire effect. After, I went back into the sprites toolbox and added an overlap block. Then I made it check overlaps from the projectile and the enemy. And I duplicated the destroy block from the other overlap block twice and changed the values to destroy the meteor and the bat if they overlap. Next, I went into the info toolbox and added a change score by 1 block into the new overlap block. And I changed the effect the enemy plays when it's destroyed to a halo. Then I went into the music toolbox and added a play sound until done block to the first overlap block, and changed its sound to a small crash sound effect. Then I added one into the second overlap and left it to play the bing. Next, I added a play sound until done when you shoot the projectile and set its sound effect to pew pew, and tried out the game. But there were 2 problems. The meteor first spawns at the top of the screen, then teleports to the player before moving, and the effects were delayed. So I quickly fixed those bugs, and here's the final game. After making 3 games in this program, 2 with a tutorial and 1 completely on my own, I can say that this is a very good and capable game making tool. It may not really be for me, but I can see some people using it and liking it. Earlier in the video, I said that this is a Scratch type game engine, While yes, it is kind of similar, I do think that it does some things better and differently. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya!